Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this UK government briefing on Russia sanctions. We have over 6,000 people registered for today's session. So I just want to say a huge thank you for your interest in coming and also for the question you've set out in advance. I'll set out how the session will work, then I'll hand over to our first speaker, the head of the Sanctions Task Force. We have two parts to today's session. The first part is a briefing from the Sanctions Task Force in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Plus, we have speakers from the Office of Financial Sanctions and Implementation, Offsea at the Treasury, and Department for Transport and Department for International Trade. And we have colleagues online from Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy for the question and answers, which is in the second part. So in the second part, we will answer as many of the questions as we can that you've already sent in through Eventbrite. Thank you very much for that. The panelists will address some of those questions in their introductory talk, and then as many of the other questions as we can get through in the second part of the briefing. You can also add questions in the chat bar, which I can see some are already doing, so thank you for that. But we may not get around to all of them given the very large number of people online. Also, we won't commit to answering all of the questions individually, but we do commit to reading all of them and using them to inform policy thinking. As this briefing is on policy and measures, it will not constitute legal advice and we will not be able to answer specific company questions. But we do plan to have a recording and we will share that via links on gov.uk when it's available. So once again, thank you for coming. Your role in implementing the sanctions set out by the government is vital. And with that, I'd like to hand over the floor for an introduction to today's briefing by Daniel Drake, who is our head of Sanctions Task Force at FCDO. Who will then pass on to Stuart for the more detailed brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to so many of you for dialing in this afternoon and thanks in advance to the organisers for setting up today's call as well. I wanted to start by setting out a bit of the context, some of the context as to where we are with our sanctions on Russia. And we've been clear all along throughout this crisis that we were prepared to impose a very swingeing set of sanctions against Russia that would exact the highest price possible for its aggression against Ukraine. We were clear before the invasion that we would do that, and we've been clear since the invasion that we would impose those sanctions and continue turning the ratchet. This is by far the most significant set of sanctions that we have ever imposed, in particular because Russia is one of the top 20 economies in the world. So this is a really significant set of sanctions that we have imposed. In many areas, we have been leading from the front, and Stuart will take you through some of those, but I'll set them out very briefly at the start. But we've been very, very clear right from the start as well that by far the strongest impact we can get from our sanctions package is by working in close coordination with our allies. And that, of course, has included the United States, the European Union, G7 partners and Five Eyes partners. But what we've increasingly found as the crisis has gone on is that, if you like, the partners that the non-traditional partners in the sanctions space have also taken some very robust action, from Singapore to Korea to elsewhere, and that is a sign really of the international outrage at the action that Russia is taking. We have been very focused on a very strong set of sectoral measures across finance, trade and transport. In finance, for example, we banned all Russian state and private companies from our capital markets. We imposed, together with our G7 partners, clear, strong restrictions on Russia's central bank. We've frozen the assets of 10 key banks and their subsidiaries, as well as a sovereign wealth fund. And there are further measures which Stuart will talk you through that we're also going to take. In the trade space, we've had a particular focus on first of all, freezing all dual use licenses for Russia, but also focusing very much on the high tech sector. You will have seen the announcement on luxury goods and in several other areas of the trade sector as well. And then on transport, we were the first country to ban Russian flagged flights from overflying or landing in the United Kingdom, and also banning all Russian shipping to the UK as well. So we've been very robust in our approach on transport as well. On top of that, as you will be aware, we have now sanctioned more than 1,000 individuals, entities and their subsidiaries, most recently making full use of the new powers which came into effect through the Economic Crime Act that reached royal assent early on Tuesday morning. That includes 69 oligarchs and elites, as well as their family members, whose net worth is well in excess of £145 billion. But it also includes large sectors of, if you like, the sort of the Russian elite around President Putin, those who have been most complicit in the invasion, in justifying it, and in leading it, and those who are associated with the regime by virtue of the positions that they play in the Russian economy. So we've now sanctioned more individuals and entities than any other ally. We have significantly increased our size in the Foreign Office in order to deliver this unprecedented response. What was the sanctions unit in the Foreign Office is now a sanctions task force, roughly 3 times the size that it was pre-invasion. But I'd also pay credit to all of the other departments in government that have scaled up their own response. The Treasury, Bays, DFT, the Home Office and others, particularly now as attention also turns to effective enforcement and implementation of the sanctions that we have agreed. And I think I can say with confidence that every government department has significantly scaled up its response, and certainly our ministers collectively are very clear that we should be very robust in the way we enforce sanctions as well as impose new measures, and there's increasing international coordination around that element as well through the new multilateral task force. I wanted for all of you to say a huge thank you to the business community and to the humanitarian community for the role that you are playing. First of all, to ensure strong compliance with the sanctions that have been imposed. I can appreciate that taking, if you like, so many steps in a short time frame can raise some questions, some concerns, and I'm very grateful to you all for ensuring that you can be fully compliant with the sanctions as they are introduced. And also I appreciate that a number of you have gone, if you like, further as a sign of, I think, probably the much wider public outrage at the way that Russia has prosecuted its invasion of Ukraine, and the steps that voluntarily many companies have taken to, if you like, express their own views in response to this unprecedented attack. We do accept, of course, that taking measures such as these has an impact on the UK economy, and our ministers have been quite clear about this in Parliament right from the start. Where possible, we try and put the relevant mitigations in place. The Treasury, other departments extremely active in that space, so that impact on the UK economy, if you like, can be minimised, and we try and focus the primary impact of the sanction on the target, which is the Russian economy, and in particular the regime of Vladimir Putin. But we do appreciate that the kind of shock that this is having on the wider global economy is something that none of us can be insulated from. The impact on the Russian economy itself, though, is already starting to be felt. In fact, is being felt very acutely. You will have tracked, I'm sure, the drop in the value of the ruble, the fact that the Russian stock market remained closed, that by many reports Russia is on the brink of defaulting on its debt, and of course a number of the effects of the sanctions that we're imposing now will continue to be felt more acutely in the coming weeks and months as they come into full force, and as Russia experiences this sense of economic isolation from the global community, which on the current trajectory is only going to grow. I'd pay a particular tribute here to the role of humanitarian organisations. I know many of you are on the line today who are diligently trying to ensure that ordinary Ukrainians who are affected by this this outrage can be supported. And as you will know, right from the start, we have wanted to put in place, if you like, the appropriate mitigations to try and ensure that humanitarian organisations, well, to ensure that humanitarian organisations could continue to function effectively, and that continues to be a very high priority for the FCDO. We'll be very keen to understand your perspectives today, to answer questions. I know that a number of questions have already been tabled. We appreciate, as I say, that it is a major undertaking for you all to ensure your compliance with the sanctions regime. We've put in a number of channels for communication, particularly through the Export Support Service, through Offsea, and through the guidance that's put up on gov.uk, which I know my colleagues will talk you through today as well. I just want to end by being very clear. We are, of course, prepared for, if you like, both scenarios. One scenario in which there is some way in which the situation will improve, and we need to be prepared as an international community to respond to that. But rather sadly, every time any of us, I'm sure, opens a news website or a newspaper, we see that you know, tragically, the situation is moving in the other direction. You will have followed the situation perhaps in Mariupol today as the latest example of that. So our ministers have been very clear with us as officials that they are prepared to continue ratcheting up the pressure, continue on this path of economic isolation of Russia and of Vladimir Putin and the regime around him, and we will continue developing measures, designating individuals that will respond to that ministerial requirement in very close coordination with our allies. So we are prepared for all scenarios, but we will certainly keep the pressure going for as long as it is needed. And at that point, I will finish and hand over to Stuart, who will talk you through the measures that we've introduced in greater detail. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Daniel, and good afternoon, everyone. So for this main part of the presentation, I'm going to provide a detailed technical run through of all of the sanctions measures that we've put in place so far in 2022 in relation to Russia. Now I'm going to focus on measures that we have already implemented in law. So I won't be providing information or commenting on measures that have been announced but not yet implemented, or speculating on future measures or designations, because for obvious reasons we're not able to do that. And for some of you on the line, Russia sanctions and perhaps sanctions in general may be a new thing, whereas others might deal with sanctions compliance every day as part of their jobs. So I'm therefore going to try and introduce the measures in simple terms, and then build in the necessary detail for everybody to be able to understand how these measures work. Next slide, please. So a quick disclaimer. So this presentation effectively summarises information that is actually already available in the legislation and also in the guidance on gov.uk. It doesn't amount to legal advice. Nothing we're saying here does. And in the Q&A, we won't be able to advise on specific situations. So you should therefore ensure that you do seek your own independent legal advice wherever you feel that that's needed. Next slide. So this is the agenda. Sorry, go back one. This is the agenda for the presentation. So I'll start with a little bit of context about this sanctions regime. We'll then briefly talk about designations and the changes we've made in that area. We'll then focus on the specific new sanctions measures, and by measures I mean the elements of the legislation that create prohibitions. And then I'm going to hand over to colleagues from other government departments to talk about licensing and implementation before we then get on to questions. So the context. So this is a sanctions regime that was carried over into UK legislation at the end of the EU exit transition period. So it came fully into force on the 31st of December 2020. And the intention at that point was to effectively continue the existing policy effect of the EU sanctions regime, which previously had direct effect in the UK. The regime we created actually merged 3 EU Russia-related sanctions regimes into UK law. So the first one of those, 269/2014, was concerning the actions undermining or threatening the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, and that was financial measures. The second one is around Crimea and Sevastopol, and these were the trade and investment measures that were put in place in relation to those regions. And then the final one was the main EU Russia sanctions regime, which had a large number of designations and other measures in it. So all of those were merged into a single regime. So if you're trying to map UK sanctions against EU sanctions, you have to bear in mind that our regime was a merged one. So the regime contains both measures and designations. So the measures are in the legislation, and they are the effectively the main sanctions. They are the prohibitions that can then be applied in different ways. Some of those apply automatically to particular descriptions of groups of people or entities, or in fact, in the case of trade prohibitions, to the country as a whole. But other ones apply only to what we call designated persons. So that's individuals and entities who we are explicitly naming in order to apply certain prohibitions to them. The main ones of those types of prohibitions that we do in that way are asset freezes and travel bans, but there are others as well. Those prohibitions apply to everyone who is on the UK sanctions list, who is named for the purposes of those prohibitions. So if you're not familiar with the UK sanctions list, please do have a look at it, and you can see how all of those measures are applied to specific individuals and entities. And most of the content in this presentation is already on gov.uk, so there's a link at the bottom there, which is our guidance, which gets updated every time we change the sanctions regime to provide up-to-date information on the prohibitions and other requirements that we have put in place. Next slide, please. So to give a sense of the regime that we started with before the crisis, it had the following prohibitions in it. So firstly, an asset freeze. That's a fairly standard sanctions measure, and effectively covers dealing with the assets of designated persons, but also making funds and economic resources available to or for the benefit of those designated persons. The second measure that was in that regime was dealing with transferable securities and money market instruments, and those are ones that were issued by entities that were listed in a schedule to the regulations. That was Schedule 2. The next prohibition on loans and credit arrangements also applied to those entities. There was a prohibition on investments in relation to Crimea. So that prohibition covered things like purchasing real estate in Crimea, but also joint ventures and other engagement with companies operating in Crimea, and also had some trade measures as well. There was a travel ban. That's another fairly standard sanctions measure, which prevents designated persons from coming to the UK. In the trade space, there were prohibitions on military items and so-called dual-use items, which are items that could be used for civilian purposes and for military purposes, where they were provided to Russia, or in the case of dual-use items, where they were provided for use by the Russian military. There are prohibitions on trade in energy-related goods, and also services related to those goods and to those energy projects. There are prohibitions on imports of any items that originated in Crimea, and trade in infrastructure related goods with Crimea, and there was a list of specific infrastructure related goods that can't be exported to Crimea. There are also prohibitions on infrastructure services and tourism services being provided in Crimea, and also some transport prohibitions on the movement of cruise ships to Crimea. Next slide, please. So as you can see on this slide, the regulations have been amended quite a few times, in fact 8 times. So the first 2 amendments were done at the same time the regulations came into force. Those are those miscellaneous amendments ones, and they were just technical tweaks to the regulations. But then in 2022, we have made 6 amendments to the regulations. So the first one that was done on the 10th of February was to change the designation criteria, which I'll get onto in a moment. The second one covered new financial sanctions. Third one covered new trade sanctions. The fourth one covered transport sanctions in relation to vessels. The fifth one covered financial prohibitions relating to the central bank. And then the sixth one, final one, covered aviation, as well as some trade prohibitions as well. Next slide, please. Obviously there was quite a lot of different amendments that were made there, and if you went onto legislation.gov.uk and clicked on any one of those, it probably wouldn't mean much because it would be a list of amendments to other regulations. If you want to see the full set of changes to the Russia regulations and a consolidated form so that you can see how they all fit into the regulations, you need to go onto legislation.gov.uk, type in the Russia Sanctions EU Exit Regulations 2019, and then make sure that you click latest available revised on the top left. That will then bring in all of the changes that we've made so far, and the National Archives have done a great job at getting all those changes into the live version on that website very quickly after they were done. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about designations now. So the first thing I wanted to cover was the changes that we made on the 10th of February to our designation criteria. So this change was made prior to the invasion, and it was a way in which we could prepare the ground for the potential that we would need to make a large number of designations. So those changes did the following. So firstly, it changed the definition of involved person. So in order to make designations, the Foreign Secretary needs to have reasonable grounds to suspect that someone is what's called an involved person. Involved person basically means individuals or entities that either are or have been involved in a particular activity, are owned and controlled by someone who has been involved in that activity, are acting on behalf of the direction of someone who's been involved in that activity, or are a member of or associated with someone who's been involved in that activity. Prior to the 10th of February, involved person meant only someone who has been involved in destabilizing Ukraine or undermining or threatening the territorial integrity, sovereignty or independence of Ukraine. However, on the 10th of February, we made the change that's on the screen, which broadened the criteria. So it added a new category of involved person, which covered obtaining a benefit from or supporting the government of Russia. That was then defined as meaning, firstly, carrying on business as a government of Russia affiliated entity, carrying on business of economic significance to the government of Russia, carrying on business in a sector of strategic significance to the government of Russia, or owning and controlling or working as a director, trustee or equivalent of one of the above types of entities. Next slide, please. So government of Russia affiliated entity is obviously not a term that you would normally use. It's a defined term in the regulations, and it is defined as follows. So it covers entities that are owned and controlled directly or indirectly by the government of Russia, entities that the government of Russia holds directly or indirectly a minority interest in, entities that receive or have received financing from the Russian Direct Investment Fund or the National Wealth Fund, or those that otherwise obtain a financial benefit or other material benefit from the government of Russia. Next slide, please. The other term that we have defined in the designation criteria is sector of strategic significance to the government of Russia. So that means that those entities that are operating in these sectors can be designated as involved persons. So firstly, the Russian chemical sector, the construction sector, the defense sector, the electronics sector, the energy sector, the extractive sector, financial services sector, information communications and digital technology sector, and the transport sector. Next slide, please. So as well as making changes to the designation criteria, we have also had some changes made to our primary legislation, which is the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018. So the Economic Crime Act, which received royal assent on the 15th of March this week, created new powers. So firstly, it enabled us to more easily align with designations that are made by our allies. And you'll have seen actually that we made use of that power this week to designate a very large number of individuals and entities. So we are able to swiftly designate where our allies have already made designations, and that's EU, US, Canada, and Australia. But there's also the ability for ministers to add other countries to that list. We can also speed up decisions on UK sanctions by simplifying the tests for designating individuals and entities. So that has changed the test of appropriateness that used to be in the regulations, and also getting rid of certain requirements relating to making and amending regulations under the Sanctions Act. So some of the reports that previously had to be provided no longer have to be. And then finally, allowing us to designate groups of individuals by description, should we wish to. So that gives us the ability to have more flexibility where there's a large number of members of a political body, for instance, that we want to designate as a group. Next slide, please. So as Daniel mentioned, we've made a large number of designations. So we've designated over 800 individuals and entities. And as Daniel said, if you include those owned and controlled, that gets us to well over 1,000 affected by it. We've designated 26 businesses, 69 oligarchs, elites and family members with a net worth in excess of £145 billion, and designated 10 key banks and the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, covering around 60% of the Russian banking sector and covering £348 billion in assets that those banks hold globally. So I'm now going to move on to trade sanctions as the first set of sanctions measures that we're going to cover in this presentation. So the first category of trade sanctions that we're covering is dual-use items. So as I mentioned previously, there was already a prohibition on dual-use items in this sanctions regime, but it only covered dual-use items that were being exported or made available to the Russian military or to specific defense-related entities in Russia. So we have acted with allies to broaden that out, and it now is simply a full dual-use ban on all items that are being made available or exported to Russia as a whole. The next thing that we have done is created a new list called the Critical Industry List. And that list is again in line with the EU and US, who've created equivalent lists, and they're effectively the same lists that we are covering, as well as another list of aviation and space items. So for all of those prohibitions, we are covering our standard set of trade sanctions prohibitions. So they cover a wide range of things. So I'm going to just quickly run through what those are and what they mean. So firstly, the simplest of those, export. So export is obviously export from the UK, and it doesn't capture items that are taken from the UK to the Isle of Man. And it only covers export from the UK and items that are exported to Russia but also for use in Russia. So that means that even if the immediate destination is not Russia, if it's ultimately for use in Russia, then the prohibition still applies. That's a really important point to understand. Supply and delivery. So these prohibitions prohibit someone from directly or indirectly supplying or delivering certain goods from a third country to a place in Russia. So that's a non-UK country to Russia. So if you're involved in moving goods in that way, then that is prohibited if you are a UK person or a person in the UK. Making available, so this covers other ways in which items can be made available to Russia, including through simply just the sale of those items. So the items won't actually have to move for that to be contravened. It's just the actual sale of those items that would cover it, as well as other things. And they cover making available items for use in Russia. So again, the items don't necessarily have to go to Russia, and also to a person connected with Russia, which is further defined in the regs, which we'll get to a bit later. Transfer. So transfer applies specifically to technology rather than goods. So technology is the intangible know-how, such as blueprints or software or other things. And the technology transfer prohibitions cover any way in which technology can be transferred, including electronic transfer, but even covering things like description over the phone. Then we get onto some associated services that apply to those aforementioned activities. So the first one is technical assistance. So this is defined in Regulation 21 and applies to the direct or indirect provision of technical assistance to persons connected with Russia, and also for use in Russia. So that means that even if the person that you're providing that technical assistance to is not in or connected with Russia, the prohibition may still apply if the goods or technology to which the assistance relates are themselves for use in Russia. So it's quite a broad application of that one. Similarly, financial services and funds follow the same sort of model. Funds is defined in Section 60 of the Sanctions Act, and financial services is defined in Section 61. So do have a look at that, see if your particular service counts as a financial service. The prohibitions apply to the direct or indirect provision of financial services and the direct or indirect making available of funds to persons connected with Russia, where that relates to an arrangement that's set out in the regulation. So, for instance, where it relates to the export, supply, delivery, making available of those items. They also prohibit the direct or indirect provision of financial services or funds to anyone in the world, where it is in pursuance of or in connection with the export, supply, etc. of items to Russia. So again, even if the person you're providing that assistance to is not in Russia or connected with Russia, if the item is ultimately going to be for use in Russia, then it is still covered by those prohibitions. And then finally, brokering services. So this covers a wide range of things and is defined in Regulation 21 as covering any service to secure or otherwise in relation to an arrangement that includes the selection or introduction of persons as parties or potential parties to an arrangement, the negotiation of that arrangement, the facilitation of anything that enables that arrangement to be entered into, and the provision of any assistance that in any way promotes or facilitates that arrangement. So it's a prohibition that is designed to capture the facilitators of a particular transaction. Next slide, please. So critical industry goods and technology. So this prohibition applies to items that are set out in a list in Schedule 2A of the regulations. So if you're following on your browser, have a look at Schedule 2A, and you'll see that it's a very long list of a wide variety of different goods, software, and technology, and it falls into the categories on the screen. So it's mainly high-tech items, but also covers some lower tech items as well, including engines, for instance, and parts for vessels and other marine systems. Next slide, please. Aviation and space goods and technology. So this category covers everything which is set out in Chapter 88 of the goods classification table in the UK tariff. So those of you that are familiar with the UK tariff, essentially everything which is in Chapter 88, but it also covers technology and software for the development, production, use of all of those items in Chapter 88. Next slide, please. So with all of these prohibitions, I'm going to just explain how they can be accepted or licensed. So just to quickly give a summary of what that means for those who aren't familiar. Exceptions are basically baked into the legislation, and they provide situations in which the prohibitions just do not apply at all. So it describes particular things that are not covered by the prohibitions. So there's no need for you to get in touch with the government to get permission. If your activity is accepted, then you can simply go ahead and do it. Obviously, that is at your own legal risk, and you have to take your own legal advice as to whether your activity definitely does fall within that exception. Licenses are a bit different. They require you to apply to the government for a license, and that will be assessed and then granted on a case-by-case basis. There is a third category of general licenses that falls sort of somewhere between the two, and general licenses are licenses granted on an overarching basis by the government that allow multiple people to use them. So they sort of fit in between the two, and we'll cover those as we go through. So for trade, exceptions are set out in Part 7 of the regulations, and licensing grounds are set out in the statutory guidance. So do have a look at that statutory guidance document. It's got a table in it which has all of these trade related licensing grounds in it. And licensing grounds effectively just give situations in which licenses can be granted. So for dual use items, the licensing grounds include those that are up on the screen. They include a wide variety of things, including safety, prior contracts. So if you have an existing contract that requires you to do something that's prohibited normally, then you can apply for a license and present that contract to the government that can verify that that is a valid contract, although that does require you to request the license before the 1st of May. And there's a few other ones as well: space cooperation, emergency situations, aircraft and maritime safety, medical, pharmaceutical, news media, cybersecurity, and UK entities in Russia. I also just wanted to highlight the humanitarian assistance licensing ground that is there. That's a very important one, and you'll notice that those are in the vast majority of our prohibitions. Those enable anything to be done in connection with a humanitarian assistance activity. Next slide, please. So on the critical industry goods and technology, there's also a wide range of licensing grounds. Again, we've got a prior contracts one, space, humanitarian assistance, aircraft and maritime safety, medical, pharmaceutical, news media, cybersecurity, information security, civil telecommunications networks, and UK entities in Russia. There is also a series of exceptions that apply for these items, and that includes where the items are in your personal effects, emergency situations, software updates, because of the wide range of items covered by this list. That's necessary. Same with the same reason for consumer communications devices, so that you can bring your mobile phone to Russia if you need to. Diplomatic missions and consular posts and international organizations, so that they can still operate in Russia, and also movement of vessels from the UK to Russia. And then aviation and space, more limited licensing. So this has a prior contracts licensing ground, and that's more limited, so it only applies to prior contracts that are executed before the 28th of March. So that has to be complied with quite quickly. There is also a general license that DIT has granted under that licensing ground in relation to insurance and reinsurance. So please do look online to find that general license if you think you can make use of it. And then there is also the same exception referred to in the last section on movement, this time of aircraft from the UK to Russia. So I'm now going to go into the financial measures. So the first financial measure is one that was actually amended from the previous set of sanctions to broaden out its scope. So this is a prohibition on dealing with transferable securities and money market instruments. And dealing with those items includes a wide range of things, including purchasing, selling those securities or instruments, but also providing investment services relating to them, but also assisting in their issuance. And the measure also extends previous prohibitions on dealing with those instruments that previously were only applied to entities in Schedule 2. So the best way to explain this is that it's been divided up into 4 categories now, and I'll go through those now. So category 1 is existing Schedule 2 prohibitions. So those are the original 2014 sanctions that covered entities listed in Schedule 2. In the second category, we have entities that are owned by those in Schedule 2. So previously, those that were owned in the UK by those entities weren't covered. We've now broadened that out so it does cover them, and that's covered in category 2. Category 3 is the broad one, and that covers all persons connected with Russia. And we'll get to the definition of that in a moment, but that was the one that Daniel was referring to in his intro, saying that it effectively applies to over 3 million entities. And then category 4 is the government of Russia. Next slide, please. So obviously category 1 is the one that's already covered, so I'm going to go straight to category 2. So category 2 is those entities that are owned by those in Schedule 2. And transferable securities or money market instruments fall within this if they have a maturity that exceeds 30 days. They're issued on or after the 1st of March 2022, which is the date that the regulations came into force, and are issued by an entity that's incorporated or constituted under the law of any part of the UK and is owned by one of those people in or entities that are in Schedule 2. And then also covers entities that are acting on behalf or at the direction of those entities. So that effectively broadens out the previous prohibition that was in place on those Schedule 2 entities that previously exempted their UK subsidiaries. So that's no longer the case. Moving on to category 3. So this is persons connected with Russia. So securities, money market instruments fall within the scope of this prohibition if, again, they were issued after the date that the regs came into force and are issued by the following: either a person connected with Russia, and I'll get onto what that means in a moment, a person other than an individual which is owned by a person connected with Russia, so basically entities that are owned by them. And then also entities that are acting on behalf or at the direction of one of those persons connected with Russia, or of course someone who is owned by them. Next slide, please. So the definition of person connected with Russia is very broad, and it covers individuals who are ordinarily resident in Russia, but it also covers an association or combination of individuals who collectively are ordinarily resident in Russia. It covers individuals or associations that are located in Russia, so physically located in Russia. It covers those entities, so persons other than individuals, that are incorporated or constituted under the law of Russia. And then it also covers entities that are domiciled in Russia. So that's what brings into scope the 3 million Russian businesses that we were talking about at the beginning. And then Regulation 4D also deconflicts some of these prohibitions. So it says that our definition doesn't cover those in Schedule 2 because they're already covered by the Category 1 prohibition that I mentioned. It also doesn't cover those who, on the date that the regs came into force, were domiciled in a country other than Russia, and those that are branches or subsidiaries of those types of entities. So if you were a branch of an international company, then you're not covered by these if you were a branch of an international company on the 1st of March 2022. Next slide, please. So then Category 4 is the government of Russia, and that is a bit simpler. It's basically those that have been issued on or after the date the regs came into force by or on behalf of the government of Russia, and there is a exhaustive definition of the government of Russia in Regulation 6. So if you want to understand exactly what we're counting as the government of Russia, have a look at Regulation 6. Next slide, please. So we're moving on now to loans and credit arrangements. So these are a kind of a sister measure to the previous one, and apply in much the same way. So they cover granting or entering into any arrangement to grant a relevant loan, and those loans are defined in 4 different categories. So a Category 1 loan is those that were covered by the existing Schedule 2 prohibitions. Category 2 loan is entities that are owned by those in Schedule 2. Category 3 is all of those persons connected with Russia, so the 3 million plus entities that we talked about. And then Category 4 is the government of Russia, so very closely mirrors the previous prohibition. Next slide, please. So there are some exceptions for the loans and credit arrangements prohibition. So they cover, firstly, we have removed an exception that existed in the old 2014 regulations. So there was an exception for non-restricted trade with Russia, but we have removed that to increase the effect of these sanctions. There was also an exception that we have maintained, which covers making emergency funds available to meet solvency or liquidity criteria for subsidiaries in the UK of persons connected with Russia, and that is to protect UK consumers and others who might be affected. And then finally, another exception covering drawdowns and disbursements of existing loans, so loans that have already been agreed that are just being drawn down or dispersed. And we've extended that to subsidiaries of persons connected with Russia. Next slide, please. So then there's a few licensing grounds for this one as well. So these are on humanitarian assistance, medical goods and services, food, so that's the production or distribution of food, diplomatic missions, space, and extraordinary situations. And those are all set out in Schedule 5, Part 1A. Next slide, please. So another new measure that we have put in place, and actually this is a pretty novel measure for us in the UK, is correspondent banking relationships. So these effectively do 2 things. Firstly, they prohibit UK credit financial institutions from either setting up or continuing correspondent banking relationships with designated persons. And when I say designated persons here, I don't mean everyone. I mean those who are specifically designated for the purposes of this prohibition. And it also covers credit or financial institutions that are owned and controlled by those specially designated persons. And the prohibition applies to correspondent bank accounts that are held by UK credit or financial institutions in any currency, so not just in sterling. And then the second part of this is that it prohibits a UK credit or financial institution from processing payments, specifically in sterling, to, from, or via one of those designated persons or credit or financial institution owned or controlled by them. Correspondent banking relationship, if you were wondering, is defined in the regulations, so that's in 17A6. And we have made one designation under this measure, which is Sberbank, the largest bank in Russia, but that is the only one that's currently designated. In case people were wondering how this sort of interacts with the asset freeze, this measure can only be applied in situations where there isn't already an asset freeze, because an asset freeze already prohibits this from happening, and a lot of other stuff as well. So this measure is only used where an asset freeze has not been put in place in relation to those entities. Next slide, please. So exceptions and licensing. So in terms of exceptions, there is one that applies to overflight and landing takeoff of aircraft. So that's where payments need to be made to enable that to happen. And then licensing grounds, we have two different categories of licensing grounds. So for both of those limbs of the prohibition, so sterling payments and correspondent banking, we have licensing grounds that cover basic needs, legal services, financial regulation, and extraordinary situations. But then we have some others that only apply to the sterling payment processing limb of this, because they're only really relevant to that, and that is, of course, humanitarian assistance activities. So if payments need to be made and processed to enable that to happen, that they can do, as well as medical goods and services, production and distribution of food, diplomatic missions, consular posts, and space activities. Next slide, please. So 3 general licenses have been granted, and my colleagues in Offsea will give a bit more information on general licenses a bit later. But they cover Sberbank, the only bank that's been designated under this, and they cover effectively the winding down of operations and correspondent banking relationships with Sberbank, as well as a slightly longer wind down period that covers energy related products. Sorry. Yeah, those are the ones that are available. My colleagues will go into a bit more detail on those a bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So another measure that we have taken in the financial space is foreign exchange reserve and asset management. So this is again a fairly novel prohibition for the UK, but we took it in concert with allies in relation to the Russian Central Bank, National Wealth Fund, and Ministry of Finance. So this is a little bit different to a normal asset freeze, and instead covers specifically providing financial services related to foreign exchange reserves and asset management to one of those 3 entities, but also to those owned or controlled by them, or those acting on behalf or at their direction. Next slide, please. So you're probably wondering what the definition of foreign exchange reserve and asset management is. So that is defined here on the slide as covering activities relating to the reserves or assets of those 3 persons. And there's some examples here of what those reserves or assets include. Next slide, please. So there are exceptions and licensing grounds for this as well. So there is an exception for authorised conduct in a relevant country, which basically just makes it so that any licenses which are granted overseas that cover UK persons, so for instance in Crown dependencies and overseas territories, still have force in the UK as well, so people don't need to apply for 2 licenses. And we have licensing grounds covering financial assistance, financial regulation, financial stability, safety and soundness of a firm, and extraordinary situations. Next slide, please. So we've also taken the opportunity, given the significant increase in the number of designations that we're making under the asset freeze, to change the licensing grounds in relation to it, to enable more activities to take place. So we've added licensing grounds for humanitarian assistance, as with all the other prohibitions I mentioned, medical goods and services, food, and diplomatic missions. So now I'm going to go on to transport measures. So firstly, measures in relation to aircraft, and these are set out in regulations 57J to 57O. So I mentioned earlier that we put a flight ban on Russian aircraft, so they can't enter the UK airspace, fly over it, or land in the UK, and we can also require them to leave UK airspace. It also gives powers to the Secretary of State to direct airport operators to detain a Russian aircraft. So that can happen if they do end up in the UK. And it also gives powers to the Civil Aviation Authority to refuse, suspend, or revoke permissions to come into the UK in respect to those aircraft. And also they can prohibit and terminate the registration of those aircraft that are owned, operated, or chartered by designated persons. And the definition of Russian aircraft includes any aircraft that are owned, operated, or chartered by a designated person or a person connected with Russia, which is defined in the same way as we covered earlier in the presentation, as well as any aircraft that are registered or flagged in Russia. And for the avoidance of doubt, this includes those who possess the legal title of the aircraft, or any share in the aircraft, or have a beneficial interest in the aircraft or any share of the aircraft. So it covers those more complex beneficial ownership chains. Next slide, please. Furthermore, on the aircraft measures, just to say in terms of exceptions, there is of course a exception for situations where landing overflight would be needed to protect the lives of those on board the aircraft or the safety of the aircraft, but there are no licensing grounds in relation to that. There is the ability for the Secretary of State to allow certain flights to take place. He can direct that in certain circumstances, for instance, in situations where humanitarian flights might need to come in. So then the other transport measures are on shipping. So these prevent Russian ships and other ships that are specified, and that's effectively similar to being designated by the Secretary of State, from entering ports in the UK, and confers powers to detain and control the movement of those Russian ships or specified ships. And then similarly, we prohibit the registration of those ships as well, where they're owned, controlled, chartered, operated by a designated person, or those connected with Russia, or are Russian flag registered, or one of those specified ships. And the definition of what all those prohibitions apply to is set out below. Next slide, please. So similarly, we have the beneficial ownership provision here. So that covers situations where you might possess the legal title to the ship or any share in the ship, have a beneficial interest in it or a share in it, or able to take decisions in relation to its operation, movement, etc. And then similarly to the aviation one, we have an exception for situations where you need to access a port in cases of emergency. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just briefly talk about additional measures. There are several measures that have been publicly announced, which we have not yet brought into force. Unfortunately, we can't give the details of those measures. They are under construction at the moment, and we will take them forward at the time when they are ready. But we have to take the appropriate amount of time to design those measures correctly, and consider any unintended consequences before we can bring those into force. So although you may have quite a few questions on measures that have been announced, we can't provide any more information in relation to those at this stage. Next slide, please. humanitarian assistance. So I wanted to, if you move to the next slide, just give a very quick bit of clarity on humanitarian assistance, because there have been quite a few situations where there's been questions from humanitarian organisations, but also other stakeholders such as financial institutions or exporters who are unclear about whether humanitarian assistance activities can go ahead where they engage sanctions. And I think the answer hopefully has been quite clear as we've been going through this presentation, but to be very clear, there are licensing grounds in place for all relevant prohibitions, and HMG strongly supports and in fact funds the delivery of humanitarian assistance activities in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. So we are strongly supportive of that activity going ahead. Our licensing authorities, who you hear from in a moment, are ready to process those licenses and can do at pace where it's urgent to enable activities to take place, and that even where they are ordinarily in breach of sanctions, as long as they comply with the humanitarian assistance licensing grounds, then they can take place. Where organisations such as NGOs, financial institutions or exporters feel that they are encountering difficulties, please do get in touch with us, and that can either be done through the Central Export Support Service, who are providing a wraparound support service for all of these Russia sanctions, but also the licensing authorities themselves, so Offsea and the Export Control Joint Unit. They can advise you on the best way in which to get that license and to enable that humanitarian assistance to still take place. So just to be very clear, we're not here to get in the way of humanitarian assistance activities. We will process those licenses in good time and allow those activities to take place. So I am now going to hand over to Courtney from Offsea.
Thanks, Stuart. And thanks for a really informative presentation there. So just a little bit about Offsea. We are part of HM Treasury, and we ensure that financial sanctions are properly understood, implemented and enforced. So to start off, I'm mainly going to focus on licensing in this part of the presentation. So could I have the next slide, please? So Offsea can issue financial sanctions licenses. A license is a written permission from Offsea that allows activity that would otherwise be prohibited. There are two main types of license that we can issue. There are specific licenses and there are general licenses. So first I'm going to talk about specific licenses. So those must be applied for in advance. They can't be issued retrospectively to cover payments already made. So you need to apply for a license well in advance of any business that you want to transact. They permit activity rather than compelling activity. They just allow you to undertake the activity, and a license doesn't confirm that a particular transaction is lawful. We can only issue specific license where there are relevant licensing grounds. So the licensing grounds for Russia regulations are listed on the right hand side of this slide. The common ones that we see a lot of application forms for are things like routine maintenance of funds and assets. So this allows for payments of fees and service charges and things like that. Legal fees, which allows people to sort of represent designated people. And prior obligations is another one. If the contract started before the designated entity or individual was listed, you might be able to apply for a prior obligation license. I think Stuart's already mentioned the new ones that we've introduced with this new lot of regulations, but the bottom four on this list have just been introduced. So they allow for humanitarian assistance, which can enable anything to be done in connection with the performance of humanitarian assistance activity. And then also ones for the medical goods and food, which allow for the provision and distribution of medical goods or food for the civilian population, and another one for diplomatic missions. Should just say, following on from what Stuart was just saying, Offsea does prioritise humanitarian applications and urgent applications where there are life-threatening circumstances. There are some other licensing grounds that apply to the specific financial measures. The ones on the right hand side apply to asset freezes, but some of these also apply to some of the financial measures. The applicable grounds are different for each measure, so you really need to check the regulations and the amendment regulations to see which ones apply. HMT licensing grounds are always listed in the schedule of the legislation. So you can find a bit more detail and information about licensing in Chapter 6 of Offsea's General Guidance, which you can find on the Offsea website. And that has lots more detail around each of these licensing grounds and what each of them means. Can I have the next slide, please? So the other type of license that Offsea can issue are general licenses. So general licenses allow multiple parties to undertake specified activities without the need for a specific license. We generally issue a general license when another licensing ground is not suitable. So in the first instance, it's best to consider whether a specific license could apply to your activity. If not, you could perhaps contact Offsea and see whether a general license would cover it, but we tend to look at specific licenses first. We don't accept applications for general licenses. Instead, the terms for using them are stated within the license, and these could include things like reporting, record keeping requirements. Some have prior notification of use. So it's important to check the general license to see which grounds apply before you use it. Most of the recent general licenses that we've issued are time limited, so they're just in place for a short period of time. Can I have the next slide, please? Here we've got a list of the recent general licenses that Offsea has issued under the Russia regime. So most of them are wind down licenses. So these are mainly in place for a few weeks to allow people to exit their positions from some of the banks who have been recently designated, or in the case of Sberbank, which is subject to different other financial restrictions. There's a basic needs license for VTB Capital and its UK subsidiaries, and this allows payments for things like insurance premiums, employees' fees and pensions, and tax. Right at the bottom, there's our most recent license, which is the one that covers Chelsea Football Club. So this was issued after Roman Abramovich was designated, and it allows the club to continue its operations by permitting things like the payment of all club employees, maintenance costs of the club, and travel to and from fixtures, and as hosting home fixtures. We've written a blog which provides a bit more information on the Chelsea licence. This can be found on Offsea's gov.uk page on our main website. On that gov.uk page, you can also find our Russian blog, which has lots of useful links relating to the recent measures. There's also links on that page to our guidance page. So the guidance page has Offsea's general guidance on it, which covers the basics of financial sanctions, our monetary penalties guidance, which covers enforcement, and our Russia guidance. The Russia guidance has recently been updated and now reflects the changes in the legislation, and we are working on updating the Q&A section at the back of that guidance. There's also links on the website to the consolidated list, where Offsea publishes a list of all the people subject to financial sanctions. You can also apply for a licence, report a financial sanctions breach or frozen funds, and subscribe to our email alert service. Thanks, that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Mark from DFT.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon. I hope you found the description of all the transport sanctions sections clear and informative. And to build on that, I just wanted to say a few quick words about the implementation of the transport provisions you just heard about. I think the main message that I wish to convey this afternoon to all transport stakeholders, but also those who are working alongside or in relation to the transport industry, so regards to airports, ports and elsewhere, is just to underline the crucial role that you have to play in implementing these measures that we've heard about this afternoon. If you suspect that an aircraft or ship in a port or airport or elsewhere could be within the scope of the sanctions restrictions you've heard about today, you really do have a critical investigation role to play to ascertain if a breach has taken place. And this equally applies if you have suspicions or information perhaps that a vessel or aircraft is planning to come to the UK, filing flight plans or the like. Because we understand that you have enormous operational experience and knowledge, as well as the existing working relationships there. And the department's looking to you to play a proactive role in making these prohibitions work as well as they can do. Then the other point to make is that the provisions are in place and the powers are in place for you to use. So there really is a whole of UK approach that we're taking in coordination with our international partners. And we're really grateful to industry colleagues who have already been proactive and who have flagged issues of concern to the department, which we're looking into. We have already produced and sent out some lines and some guidance that have been sent directly to transport stakeholders, which aims to explain these measures in as much detail as possible. And I really hope that that's helpful in supporting you in implementing these measures. And just to reiterate a sort of a final point is that this really is important feedback, because it keeps the department up to speed on what's happening in real time, and also enables us to see all the sorts of issues that you may be encountering, so that we can continue to support you as and where we absolutely can do. And understanding as well that the powers in the legislation are there and they're yours to use, and to keep that feedback coming will be really helpful for us to support you and to help you implement them as best as possible. Thank you very much for that, and I'll pass you over to Richard in the Department for International Trade.
Yeah, good afternoon. So today I want to set out how two parts of DIT's business-facing operations are supporting firms right now with respect to their trade in the region. First of all, a number of the previous presenters have already mentioned DIT's Export Support Service. So the Export Support Service was originally set up to handle inquiries from business with respect to trading in the European Union following EU exit, and has now been pivoted to providing support for firms wanting to engage with government information with respect to trading with Russia or Belarus in particular right now. So the service is open 7 days a week, 8 AM to 10 PM, and are typically responding to inquiries within a couple of working days at the latest. And we're receiving a high number of inquiries right now, and continue to build up our evidence base and make sure we can link businesses to the expertise wherever it is in government. So it's a single front door for information. The second area I want to talk about is, which has also been mentioned, is with respect to licenses. So DIT hosts the Export Control Joint Unit. The unit is the UK's licensing authority for exports of strategically controlled goods, software and technology. They've issued a number of notices to exporters of strategically controlled items in the last few weeks. And as others have said, they have stepped up their ability to respond to queries with respect to licenses in recent weeks. Also worth signposting that they're hosting a further webinar to talk through more details on the licensing process on the 24th of March. I've included a link to that on the slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for those introductions. Can I just check whether Mark from Department for Transport was needed to say anything?
Hi there, I think I've covered the transport part already.
Okay, that's covered. Thanks.
No problem. Thanks, Ian.
Let's just move on now. If we can leave this slide up here, which gives you all of the details of government contacts. We're going to move into the second part of the session, which is questions received in advance and today on the chat. So you'll see in the chat Q&A, some of the questions have already been answered, but we wanted to spend some time on those who had sent advanced questions in as well. So we've got a fair selection. We'll get through as many as we can. I'm going to start off with one on humanitarian side. Haven't been that many questions on that in advance, but let me just ask this question. So Stuart, I'm going to ask this question to you. So would the government consider incorporating a humanitarian exception for Ukraine or humanitarian general licenses within future Russian sanctions statutory instruments and the current SIs?
Right, thanks a lot, Ian. So yeah, this sort of follows on from what I was just saying at the end of my presentation. So you know, as I stated there, we do not want to complicate or get in the way of humanitarian assistance activities being provided, but obviously we have to balance that against the integrity of the sanctions that we're putting in place. So as I said, we put in place licensing grounds for all of the relevant prohibitions that are drafted in a wide way that cover any activity that's necessary for a humanitarian assistance activity to take place, and obviously that then includes the sort of not just the direct provision of humanitarian assistance, but the support activities and other things that are necessary to make that assistance happen. We are continuing to engage very closely with humanitarian organisations and our international partners, and we have a tri-sector working group with the financial sector and the NGO sector, where we work through these potential barriers in real time. We're obviously considering all options available to us to support humanitarian action, and we'll consider further any changes that might be necessary, as well as looking at any future prohibitions that we put in place and what the most appropriate way there is to enable humanitarian assistance activity to continue to happen. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Stuart. The next question is still for you. It will be a group for you first, just to let you know. This is from an aviation manufacturer of aviation-related safety equipment. Our goods fall under the trade sanctions in place. Are any exemptions or licenses likely to be granted for safety-related equipment?
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. The way in which our prohibitions tend to operate is that we don't exempt specific items on the list in all cases, because you know, simply wouldn't have been any point in us putting them on the list to start with. However, we do have safety-related exceptions and licensing grounds in relation to aviation. So do have a look at that to see if you can benefit from any of those. They apply to different prohibitions in different ways, but do have a look. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. And the next one was on Regulation 28.3. So question is, does Regulation 28.3 prohibit reinsurance of marine vessels calling at Russian ports? Marine is included as a critical industry good, and Regulation 28.3b includes indirect delivery to Russia.
Thanks. So just so people who don't have the regs in front of them know what we're talking about, this is financial and services and funds that relate to restricted goods and technology. So that this is this rather broad prohibition that I was talking about previously in relation to goods and technology. So these measures are trade prohibitions, so they're targeted at the export of goods to or for use in Russia and related activities. However, it is obviously complicated when particular goods that are listed on the list can also move under their own power. So there is an exception that we've included in Regulation 60C that permits vessels moving from the UK to Russia, where that isn't for the purposes of a change of operator or ownership, as well as allowing associated services, including insurance and reinsurance, to still take place. The DIT are also going to be granting a general license, I think today, to enable equivalent movements from third countries, as well as associated services relating to those movements, including insurance and reinsurance services. So I hope that helps.
Thanks very much. 28.3 is popular. There's another question on it. So regulation 28.3 is applicable to critical industry goods, which include aircraft and marine. The equivalent EU regulations make no mention of marine. If vessels are affected, is there a disparity?
Thanks. So looking at the list that is in our regulations and also the list that's in the EU regulations, they are actually well aligned. So actually the UK, EU and US all have a listing in category 6 of the list, which covers vessels, marine systems or equipment and specially designed components therefore. So do have a look at that in category 6 of the list, because I think as far as I'm aware, those are actually very well aligned. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Next question. Is there an existing or plans to develop a portal that allows SMEs and others to simply check a product tariff code against the sanctions list?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very good question. So the long answer to this, I'm afraid, is that it's not as simple as, because not all items are controlled just because of their tariff code. So some items we do simply specify their tariff code in the sanctions regulation. So those ones relatively straightforward. And actually, if you look on the UK integrated online tariff, you'll find that there is information on there about any prohibitions and restrictions in place in the UK in relation to the items under that tariff code. So I think they're down as footnotes on that system. So do have a look at that system. However, it is slightly more complicated for some items, such as dual use items, where they are controlled not because of their tariff code, but actually because of their capabilities. And so it won't be everything that is in a tariff code that is covered. It would only be maybe a small subset of a particular tariff code that's covered. So, for instance, you might have a CD that has restricted technology on it, and if it has restricted technology on it, then it's covered. But obviously, not all CDs have restricted technology on them, so they wouldn't all be covered. But if you look on the tariff, online tariff, it will say you need to check to see if your item under this particular code is covered. So it's not a one size fits all, but it is a good starting point. So if you have a look at the integrated online tariff, that will give you a warning flag if a particular item that you're trying to export is subject to any prohibitions or restrictions.
Thanks very much, Stuart. This next one was a short question, but it's come up a lot. Should we still be quoting Russia for goods?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a very broad question, but I think all I can say in relation to this one is that businesses will have to keep an eye on the sanctions measures that come out in relation to the export of goods. And obviously, the stuff that I've explained in this presentation should hopefully help to explain some of that. But do have a look at the lists of items and look at the how that compares against the items that you're exporting. Consider whether the technical descriptions of items could cover the ones that you are involved with. Companies should also look at the financial sanctions, though you might not immediately think that that's relevant to exports. Of course, if you're transacting with someone who is subject to, for instance, an asset freeze, then either providing any finance to them, but also if you provide any economic resources to them, and the economic resources does include goods, includes anything of monetary value, then you'll be breaching sanctions as well. So it doesn't matter what the good is, if you're providing it to someone who is designated or someone who's owned and controlled by someone who's designated, then that would also breach sanctions. So you do need to do your due diligence on all of that where you are transacting with Russia.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Moving swiftly along, we're getting through them quite nicely. As an only representative under UK Reach, for Russian-based substance manufacturers, allowing GB businesses to import their substances. Can I continue to offer this service now in the future?
Thanks. I think this question is talking about import of chemicals. The only import restriction that we have in place at the moment is in relation to military goods and technology. However, there's obviously been other import related things that have been announced and will come into force relatively soon. You do need to kind of do your due diligence on what has been announced, but also the measures that are currently in place. But in general, if your good is not listed and it's not covered, you're also not transacting with a designated person, then you should be able to go ahead with that import. But obviously, do ensure that you continue to check for new prohibitions that might come in place.
Thanks very much. Next one is, I have equipment part manufactured for Gazprom Russia. As we cannot ship these goods, Gazprom are looking to sell to a Chinese-based company. Does this breach sanctions?
Thanks. So I think this is a very specific case, and we can't really give legal advice on particular situations. What I would say is look at the guidance that's online as to whether your item that you're exporting is restricted for export to Russia. You'll also need to check about the end use of the entity if ultimately it's going to be used in China. And as I understand the question, I think we're talking about something going via Russia ultimately to China. You need to look at the measures that are in place for China, including the UK's global human rights sanctions regime, and also ordinary export controls, where it's prohibited to export anything for a military end user in China, but also specific military items. So do check all of those things to make sure that your export is permitted. And if you need to apply for a license, if it's a licensable item, then please reach out to the Export Control Joint Unit.
Thanks very much, Stuart. The next question is on fish. Can the government confirm if tariffs on Russian-sourced whitefish apply to catch that goes via a third country for processing, or is it just fish that is caught in Russia and comes straight to the UK? When will the tariffs on goods like Russian grain and Russian whitefish start from?
Thanks. So this comes into the category of things that have been announced but not implemented in full yet. So we can't give details on that until it actually starts applying and the full details are published. We are planning to legislate for this using powers under the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act 2018, and it will be operationalised in the UK's customs systems, which are Chief and CDS, and that will be happening next week. So wait and see it on that one, and do look out for the full details that will be coming out.
Thanks very much. Moving swiftly along, we are a US-owned, UK-based company shipping civil goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which then go on to assemblies which ship onto the US with an end user in Russia. Should we be continuing to ship? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this is I guess a typical supply chain really, where things are incorporated and they move around different countries. All I would say on this one is you do need to look at the way that the UK sanctions are drafted, which I mentioned earlier, which include items that are for use in a country. That's really important. So if you know that an item is going to be used in a sanctioned destination, and that item is controlled by UK sanctions, then you shouldn't be exporting it. You also, of course, need to check with parties in other countries. So you mentioned the US. You need to check with parties in the US to make sure that they themselves are abiding by any relevant sanctions regulations or other export control regulations, for instance, in their own jurisdiction, to make sure that you're not exporting something that itself is then being exported in breach of other countries' sanctions. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Stuart. Another aircraft one. So we manufacture castings for customers in France. End use has been declared as Sukhoi Russian regional jet. Are we still permitted to export, or do we need to ask if they're for new build or MRO?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think this is very similar to the previous question, really, where things are going between multiple countries. You do need to check the UK sanctions. You do need to consider whether indirectly you might be making an economic resource available for the benefit of a designated person. Given that this is an aerospace company, and we have designated quite a lot of entities in that area, including the United Aircraft Corporation, which has a large number of subsidiaries. You do need to check not just, and this is an overarching point I think everybody needs to be aware of. You need to check not just the UK sanctions list, but you also need to consider whether an entity that you're making economic resources available to might be owned or controlled by someone who's on that list. So again, really important to do your due diligence on that. And then finally, given that France was mentioned, you do need to also just check that the company you're exporting to is abiding by EU sanctions as well, which would apply in France. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. A detailed one now on Regulation 18A of the Russia Sanctions EU Exit Regulations 2019, which you covered at the top. Please provide guidance as to the banks, financial institutions which would be captured under Regulation 18A2D and E.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean this is sorry, just for the benefit of everyone. 18A is around the provision of financial services relating to foreign exchange reserves and asset management. So this is the one that I presented on earlier, covering the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, the National Wealth Fund, and the Ministry of Finance. D and E cover those who are owned and controlled directly or indirectly by those three types of entity, and also those who act on behalf or at their direction. You will see these types of provisions in quite a few places in our sanctions regulations. However, we aren't able to provide definitive lists of these, partially because it wouldn't be practical, but also because it changes regularly, and so we can't take a snapshot in time and simply apply that. So what is needed is for, on a case-by-case basis, companies to consider ownership and control and acting on behalf of or at the direction in relation to the particular entity that they may be considering doing business with, and do the due diligence on them at the time that the activity is going to take place, to make an assessment as to whether they're owned and controlled or are acting on behalf at the direction of those entities. And that's quite an important principle of how the system works. The government can't always provide you with a definitive list of everyone that you need to screen against, for instance. Thanks.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions to group together. So it was announced that Russian nationals, and this is probably the most frequently asked question in advance, it was announced that Russian nationals will be subject to a deposit limit of £50,000 on UK bank accounts. Please, can you clarify if dual nationals and UK residents are exempt, like in the EU and Switzerland? And then second question, does the panel anticipate an extension of UK sanctions to the provision of professional services and insurance to Russian entities?
Thanks. So yeah, the first one of these I think also falls into the category of measures that have been announced but not yet implemented, and so we can't really give detail on exactly how this is going to be implemented in the UK, as the measure is under construction as we speak. We are interested, however, in any effect that the EU measure is having on particularly UK entities, and where you are engaging with government or you wish to engage through the Export Support Service, then please do pass that information on, as it's helpful for us to understand, given that these sanctions have been put in place quite recently, so important for us to understand the impact of other countries' sanctions on UK entities. On the second question around professional services and insurance, we've obviously already put in place some insurance related prohibitions. So the prohibitions that relate to goods include financial assistance prohibitions that cover insurance, and also there are some standalone insurance provisions, including in relation to aviation and space goods. However, unfortunately, I can't comment on future measures or designations, as to do so would blunt their effect. So I won't be able to give any more information on forthcoming things beyond what ministers have already announced.
Thanks very much. And then just one final one for you before I come on to some questions for Courtney at Offsea. So this question is, we create software solutions for the UK, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Channel Islands brokers in the general insurance industry. We have a solution to check the UK and USA sanctions lists. Should we be checking other lists?
Thanks. Yes, it's a very good question. Obviously, given that we're the UK government, we are primarily concerned with whether you are implementing UK sanctions. But I should say that UK sanctions also include the sanctions that we have to put in place by virtue of our UN obligations. So by implementing UK sanctions, you are also making sure that you are consistent with the relevant UN sanctions. So that's really important to understand. The other sanctions that have been mentioned, I think it's really up to businesses to determine whether they want to and feel they need to comply with the sanctions of other countries. Obviously, if you operate in those jurisdictions, then it's especially important that you comply with them because it's legally binding on you to do so. But we've also seen companies that decide they voluntarily want to align with the sanctions of other countries as well. So it's very much a choice for you, but obviously where it's legally binding, you absolutely should comply with those.
Thanks so much, Stuart. That was a mammoth session for you on the questions. I'm now going to turn to Courtney. So some questions that have come in advance, and thanks very much to everybody who sent them in advance. It's proving very useful. So the first question for Courtney is, if your firm is not the custodian but the broker, is there a requirement to inform the third-party provider of the match or potential match, as well as Offsea or just Offsea?
So I think this question is referring to asset freezes. So there are some reporting requirements on asset freezes to Offsea. Those reporting, so certain firms, particularly relevant firms, are required to report to Offsea. A list of those relevant firms and who's covered by those can be found on our website. I would say that, yeah, due diligence should be undertaken at every level. And as a broker undertaking business with sanctions exposure, it's for you to conduct the appropriate due diligence against your appetite to risk. Where you've identified a potential asset freeze target, match to the sanctions list or to the Offsea consolidated list, you do want to consider reporting this to Offsea, and it's up to you to whether you inform the third party or not. However, this should also, whether you have informed them or not, should also form part of your asset freeze reporting.
Thanks very much for that one. The next one, if a company's CEO is sanctioned, how do you deal with a subsidiary entity of the main company? Both the main company and the subsidiary company are not currently sanctioned.
So in Offsea's general guidance, in Chapter 4, we've set out our position on ownership and control. That can be found on gov.uk. So sanctions apply to the direct and indirect making available of funds or economic resources. So it's hard to generalise, but if the CEO is the ultimate beneficiary of the company, then you would need to apply the ownership and control considerations.
Thanks very much, Courtney. The next one, what are the consequences for businesses that continue to act for Russian clients who have been sanctioned by the UK government?
So continuing to undertake business contrary to the sanctions regulations, which are enforced at the time, is a criminal offence. So it undermines the UK's foreign policy and security goals, and as such, we take it very seriously. Depending on the nature of the case, it could be dealt with by Offsea either through a civil monetary penalty, which can be imposed of £1 million or 50% of the total value of the breach. Or if the case requires it, then we can refer it to law enforcement, where the maximum penalty is 7 years in prison.
Thank you very much for that one. A few more left for you, Courtney. So the next one is a non-UK corporation is owned 100% by a UK corporation. Is the non-UK corporation subject to Russia's sanctions as described earlier in the presentation?
So this is all very dependent on how the company is legally structured. It depends who owns it, where it's domiciled, and it also depends on which prohibition of the regulations that you're referring to, because there are different prohibitions, whether it's a straightforward asset freeze, whether it's the investment restrictions and the financial restrictions, or some of the export regulations. So I'm afraid I can't give a clear answer to that one.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for that one. The next one's quite a long question, and I'm going to refer to the general license, and you might want to be able to explain to others what that actually is. So do UK companies need to apply for use of general license? The reference is INT 2022129546, or does it extend automatically to any relevant institution that wishes to carry out wind down transactions as permitted by the license?
So I think this is one of the wind down licenses for some of the Russian banks. As I mentioned in the earlier part of the presentation, there's no need to apply to use any of the financial sanctions general licenses that are issued by Offsea. But some of those licenses do have specific reporting requirements, and those are set out in the terms of the license. So do consider the reporting requirements in the license.
Thank you very much for that one. The last one for you before I then come on to Chris at Bayes for a couple of questions. So your last question at the moment is, what policy considerations will be taken into account by Offsea when exercising its discretion to grant a license?
So I think I covered some of this earlier on, but in order to apply for a specific license from Offsea, you need to complete an application form, which is on the Offsea website. Basically, a fully completed application form with as much detail as possible will help your license application. So we particularly want to see information about what you're requesting, the exact payments and routes, what licensing ground you're applying under, and the urgency of the application. We also need evidence of what's taking place, which you have to submit alongside the application form. So the more information you give us, the quicker the process will be, and the less we're likely to have to come back to you and ask you for more information. We published an introduction to licensing blog last year, which you can find on the Offsea blog website. So have a look for that, and that will give you a lot more information around what you need to do when applying for an Offsea license. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Courtney, for all of those detailed responses. Much appreciated. And again, thanks to everybody who put the questions in advance. Now coming on to some energy relevant questions, and Chris from Bays is going to join us for this part. So I'm just going to read out two questions and then ask Chris to respond. So does the designation of a CEO such as Alexei Miller extend to the corporate, in this case Gazprom, becoming subject to an asset freeze? And second part, can I transact with Rosneft now that Sechin has been listed?
Thanks, Ian. So an asset freeze or travel ban applies to the specific individual or entity designated, as well as entities that they own or control. The test for ownership and control is set out in Regulation 7. I think that's been mentioned already. I mean, also to note, there are separate measures that restrict specifically the issuing of debt and equity to all companies domiciled in Russia and making loans to them.
Thank you very much for that one. So the next question is, do the decision makers consider the effects of sanctions on Russia, how the effects they have on our own country? And if so, how do they judge who should suffer most here? Noting that fuel and gas prices have risen 51% in a year.
Thanks, Ian. Well, these are, of course, very important considerations that we take extremely seriously. Since the invasion, we've seen volatile oil and gas prices, which were already at historic highs, and further volatility cannot be ruled out given Russia's aggressive actions. I'll add that later this month, the Prime Minister will set out a British energy security strategy, how we will become more energy self-sufficient. At the heart of the strategy will be green energy of all kinds.
Thank you very much for that. So we've come to the end of most of the advanced questions, and we've tried to answer as many of the questions that have come in online. But we've got another question. I think that Stuart, I hope we'll be able to answer this one, on what is the position of sanctions for British overseas territories.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is a very good question. It's the UK government's policy that all of our sanctions will apply in the British overseas territories, and in fact the designations that we make apply automatically in all of the overseas territories, and there are agreements in place effectively with all of the British overseas territories that they will apply UK sanctions, and we legislate for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think we've just got time for another question on digital currencies. And the question is for Courtney. So if Courtney's there, does the UK government have any plans to extend to digital assets and currencies?
So we do currently economic resources and funds which need to be frozen do extend to digital currencies and crypto assets. So they are also already covered by economic resources and funds under the terms of an asset freeze. Thanks
very much. I think we've covered an awful lot there. At the sort of coming to the end now, so I just wanted to ask Stuart if there were any final comments he'd like to make before I close the session.
Thanks, Ian. Obviously, we've covered a lot of detail in this presentation, and for those who are new to sanctions, it might be a little bit baffling. So please do use all of the resources that we have made available. Most importantly, the statutory guidance, which is set out on the Russia regime page on gov.uk, and you can see it there as the first link that's in that further resources list. So that goes into more detail actually than we've done in this presentation, but also you can read through in your own time and really make sure that you understand how the different prohibitions apply. Obviously they are not simple, but they've been designed to have specific effects on Russia, whilst also balancing that against what we heard in one of those final questions, which is the potential impacts on the UK and our allies as well. So you know, if you're wondering why sanctions can't be simpler, there's a good reason for that, in that they are striking a really important balance. We really appreciate the efforts of industry and other stakeholders, including NGOs, in making these sanctions operate, and you know, as you know, we can't do it without you. So just a big thank you for all of your efforts during the last few weeks, especially in order to catch up with the sanctions that we've been putting in place. As I've said, other sanctions have been announced, and there are more to come, and we will try and maintain the engagement with industry as much as we possibly can on an ongoing basis, so that we're keeping you updated on the most recent sanctions. But the first thing we will always do when we make new regulations is to immediately update our statutory guidance. So if you see that new regulations have been published and you need some information, go straight to the statutory guidance, where you will get the best explanation possible. If you have further questions, of course, you can contact us through the Export Support Service, but also if you feel that you need a license, you can get in touch through Offsea e-alerts if it's the Offsea mailbox if it's related to financial sanctions, or export control joint unit mailbox if it's or import control mailbox if it's related to trade sanctions, or the transport sanctions mailbox if it's on transport sanctions. So we're whilst we're obviously very busy at the moment, we are here to help and help you to comply with these sanctions. As I said at the beginning, unfortunately, we won't be able to give specific legal advice on specific situations, but in those situations, please do seek your own independent legal advice. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks to everyone who's participated today, both the speakers, everyone who's dialed in, and everyone who asked a question in advance. Do let us know if that worked well for you. And we had over 6,000 people register for this, so we couldn't open the mic to everybody, but having the questions in advance helped the panel to start to prepare and respond to some of them live. This has been a cross-government briefing, so we hope that is useful to show the government is working together as a whole. Further webinars and briefings will be led by different departments. Export Control Joint Unit has mentioned on the call today. They have one next week, as mentioned by Richard. For this session, lots of people have asked, will there be a recording? There will be a recording, and we'll put the link on sanctions pages once it's available to give a wider distribution. And just to say thanks again, all of your questions are valuable for informing policy decisions, even though we can't reply to all of the individual questions or specific company questions. You can follow up with the Export Support Service. And just finally, huge thanks to the technical team for making this happen. Using Teams Live has allowed us to reach a much wider audience than previous technologies. And with that, just wishing you a good rest of the day.